All right, well, good morning. If you haven't completed your Christmas shopping yet, it's okay. I just want to know, I used to have a tradition of going like on Christmas Eve years ago and doing I thought I didn't get to use that. Okay, well, I'll go over here then. Anyway, I used to go do that. And so the nice thing about going on Christmas Eve is that it limited your choices on what you could buy for people. Right? I mean, you were left for what was there. So you wound up with like one of those foot warmer things or something like that, whatever was left in the aisle at the store. But Christmas Day would come, and I would get up early, and I would set out the camera to record the expressions on the children's faces when they came out of their bedrooms to see what they had received at Christmas time. And I'd love to tell you that they came out of their bedrooms like jumping in the air, right? But usually it was kind of like this. Oh, I kind of look around. Oh, yeah, that's what I was expecting, right? That kind of look on their face. They so quickly became jaded with things, and as much as I would try, like the time that Santa brought a ping pong table down the chimney somehow and set it up in the living room, where I later had to take it apart to get it out of the door. But again, those kind of things we think about. We put so much stock in trying to get joy to happen by what is received in the moment without putting in the context of what it is. And Isaiah 35 is where we're going to be today. Go ahead and turn to that, and I'll read it in a bit. But before we do, I want you to think, when we get the perfect gift, we get excited for a little while. But when we realize in Christ, God has given us the greatest gift that doesn't wear out, doesn't need batteries replaced, doesn't become obsolete over time, then really our joy is both loud and leaping, right? And we need to remember that. There's not anything intended to be quite so calm about our faith, yet because we seem to maybe experience it without a freshness, sometimes we're awfully way too quiet about it. And I'd like to encourage you today to hear the text we're going to look at a bit and get kind of engaged with it some. And I start with this, and I want to apologize up front, but I had to leave last Sunday afternoon to go welcome this guy into the world. And I saw the video of last Sunday evening's presentation. It was wonderful, and I hated to miss it, and I had not planned on miss it because Tyler was supposed to come next week, but he came a little early. So there you go. I got the response. I went, aw. Can we all just give us an aw? Aw. Tyler can stand in for every cute and cuddly baby that there ever is there. And so a welcome for him. But it reminds me that one time when I was at the pediatrician's office with our children, there was a sign that said, a newborn baby is a message from God that life should go on. Right? I thought, that's about right? That God's not done here. Sometimes after we live many years, we think, man, this is bad, this is done, we should just, it should all just go away. But no, God's not done here, and we need to remember that. I also thought about one way I could try to cheer you up today was kind of give you this kind of substitution story and let you think that as bad a day as you may ever possibly have, there are at least 1 billion people on the planet that would trade their best day for your worst. Right? But that doesn't make you feel any better. Right? It doesn't. In fact, what really will make us feel better, what we really need to hear is that there is someone who will trade every worst day in all of our lives for all the best and the greatest God could possibly give. And that person is Jesus Christ. The Incarnation is all about God saying that's what's going to happen. I'm showing up. Now, some of y'all, I remember I was telling this to Mark, and I said, hey man, Deion Sanders is moving from coaching at Jackson State, Mississippi to Colorado University. And Mark goes, is he a coach? That's awesome. It's been a couple of years, but that's all right. It's been there in this kind of obscure place, and he's done a good job. And he shows up in this meeting to the players, and I'm not trying to get Deion Sanders to preach and not elevate him as a person. I don't know everything about him, but he walks in to the team, and he says, I'm coming, and I'm bringing my luggage with me. And it's Louis, which means Louis Vuitton. He's bringing the good stuff and changes the environment of the room. The players at Colorado who went 1-11 last year and what seemed to be existing with complacency, all of a sudden had this guy show up and said, things are going to be different now. And some of you need to decide if you're going to be a part of this. And he goes on a little bit more and he says, there's this thing called a transfer portal, and some of you guys, y'all probably just need to go ahead and transfer somewhere else and make room for me to bring in really good players. You could just see him just kind of go like that. Now, I'm hoping that there's a lot of preachers today that don't preach that way. Because the thing about it is that God isn't about bringing in somebody better than you. He's about bringing you into his work and on the field, and he's about transferring and transforming you. God doesn't show up, and Jesus doesn't show up and say, I want you out of here and I'm going to start fresh. He says, I'm going to start with the 1-11s, and I'm going to take those of you who think you're losers, and you're going to be a champion because I'm a champion. And that's what he's done for us. And Isaiah 35 is this text that we need to continue and look at today. It is a very loud text. And I hope that I can do it justice. It shouts right in the middle of a bunch of difficult and dark texts. It kind of is a gear shift in the book of Isaiah, where you go from God's judgment, God's wrath, God's denouncement on the complacency of the people of Israel, the evil within their midst, and the evil that's around them, and all that's going to happen, and how bad it's going to get. And then all of a sudden comes this sweet section. Isaiah 35 says, the desert and the parched land will be glad. The desert and the wilderness will rejoice and blossom like the crocus. It will burst into bloom. It will rejoice greatly and shout for joy. Y'all aren't used to me being real loud, I know. But, it's kind of a rainy night. Maybe you were like me, you were awake a lot. It was stormy, a lot of thunder. You'd really just as soon have a short little nap, but this is not the time for it. It goes on to say, the glory of Lebanon shall be given to it, the majesty of Carmel and Sharon. They shall see the glory of the Lord and the majesty of our God. In other words, he's saying God is coming. And it's going to be awesome. And however good it is in Lebanon, however wondrous it is, however beautiful it is, where all those cedars grow among the mountains. However great it is to look upon the expanse of the Mediterranean Sea on the Mount of Carmel, that beautiful kind of luxurious country up to the north and east of where modern day Israel is today, not too far from Haifa. It's just beautiful there. He says, as good as you might think all that is, it's going to pale in comparison to God's presence being among you. Oh, that's huge. Then he goes on to say this. He said, hey, strengthen the feeble hands. Steady the knees that give way. Say to those with fearful hearts, be strong. Do not fear. Your God will come. He will come with vengeance, with divine retribution. He will come to save you. I don't know about you. I need to be reminded of that often. Because I can quickly look for a sense of salvation, a sense of strengthening of my hands and steadying of my knees based on either my circumstances or my surroundings or the people that are around me and what people might think and any kind of success or any kind of failure. I mean, I can feel like I've got that strength based on situation. But he's saying, no, if you're the people of God, man, these things about you are solid, not because of your situation, but because of his salvation. And we've got to remember that. He says he will come to save you. Then just to skip down a bit, it says, then the eyes of the blind will be opened and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Are you catching a theme here, right? That all these physical things that seem to happen to us, the longer we live and the more difficulties we go through, the injuries we may sustain, the frailties and faults among these bodies are getting addressed here. It says, then the lame leap like a deer and the mute tongue shout for, then will the lame leap like a deer and the mute tongue shout for joy. Water will gush forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert. And that I don't know about you, if you've ever been in a desert, the word stream doesn't get used a lot there. That's why it's a desert. Right. And so what's happening in this prophetic word of Isaiah, as he's certainly aware of what's happening in the present, he's giving this great imagery, not just literally but figuratively, of what God does when God shows up. And I want to think, man, if I'm a follower of Christ, why do I live like I'm in days when eyes are closed and ears are stopped and knees are shaky and limbs are weak? Because the joyful message of Christmas is that God is here. Jesus is here. Why live in the before days? You see, Isaiah has been building up in his text, is saying, in that day. If you read through Isaiah, look for that little phrase over and over again. In that day. In that day, this is what's going to happen. Sometimes judgment, sometimes it's deliverance, sometimes it's destruction, sometimes it's construction. All of those things that's happening when God shows up. Wrath upon the sinful and redemption upon his people. God is doing that in that day. Guess where we are? This little baby that we are going to celebrate on December 25th didn't stay in the cradle. He went around and he proclaimed quite clearly, this is the day of the Lord. That day is here. And my faith is in the day that these things have happened. Look again at some of the texts that it goes on to say. And you can kind of look down at verse 8 with me. It says, a highway shall be there, and it shall be called the Holy Way. Only the redeemed will walk there, and those the Lord has rescued will return. They will enter Zion with singing. Everlasting joy will crown their heads. Gladness and joy will overtake them, and sorrow and sighing will flee away. Now, I don't know how you're wired. There are those people who are just basically joy donors, right? You know those people, right? They're kind of perpetually happy. They just kind of have that automatic smile on their face. And then there's people at the other end of the expression on their face is often kind of dour and sad. And maybe that may not be how they feel on the inside, but on the outside, you want to ask them, is something bothering you? And it really might be. But you need to know that sometimes people that have the smile all the time and the best jokes are covering up that something's really bothering them. So this is not this kind of just simple, expressive, outward declaration of joy. This is what's really going on in a transformed life. When we realize that God has inundated us with his presence. And the results are listed there. I don't know about y'all. It was good to get rain last night. Was it good for y'all too? I mean, it kept me awake. The gauge said we got over 6 inches at our house. Yeah, some of y'all are going like, oh, wow, I'd only got like 3. But this isn't a comparison show, right? There were a few months back where we'd have been glad to get 3 tenths, right? The type of streams in the desert he's talking about, those wadis that exist today, if you go over to the Holy Land or you look even down into the Sinai, there are valleys. There are these places that it looks like a river ran, and every once in a while, there will be a storm that will give a certain downburst and a little bit of water will flow through those valleys. And if you travel around, you'll see the Bedouin tribes, the people who have like the big long flat tents. You may see them dressed in black. They travel around there, and you'll see them camped by some of those kind of, well, my grandfather called them wash. It's W-A-S-H, but he had an R in there. And in those, they would be camped there. And I asked one of the folks from there, I said, why do they camp there? There's not any water. And they said, oh yeah, they know there's water there. You just have to dig down for it. It's just a little bit underground. And, you know, sometimes we have to remember that the water is there where God has provided the water before. And when it doesn't feel like the water is there, and it may feel like it's a dry time in our life, that's where God has provided the water before. We need to know maybe it's time for us to just dig a little deeper down to it. So I want to encourage you. If you're in a time where it feels like it's dry, let this be a time to pull out the shovel and dig a little bit down and remember the time of God's plenty. That's what Isaiah is kind of talking about. He's referring back to the story of the children of Israel moving through the desert from Egypt to the promised land, about God had provided for them again and again until they got to the land of milk and honey. See, God knows what is needed. God's not making a guess, wrapping it and checking and seeing what it is that you need to be provided. He knows what it is. And when it comes, like it says, this is for those that are the redeemed. And do you hear this? This can sound kind of exclusive, right? Only the redeemed will walk there, and those the Lord has rescued. But I want you to think, somebody somewhere didn't think there was a limit on who could be rescued and redeemed, or none of us would be here. Right? This wasn't just for those who are the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is for those of us who are descended from the Jameses and the Ollis Vernons. That's my family tree, and that name will never be given to one of my grandkids. But we are here because somebody said, this guy, this woman, this girl, this boy, they can know Jesus. They're not beyond his covering. They're not so dry. They're not so lame. They're not so blind. They're not so deaf that they cannot hear and know and live and proclaim Christ. I mean, that's what God does. Yeah, we can take this text and say, yeah, hey, one day God's going to make everything bounteous. There's going to be this wonderful thing, that heaven's going to be glorious. But you know what? What I said a while ago, yeah, we're living for that day, but we're also living in that day. God is already doing amazing things in the outpouring of his Spirit. And we need to recognize that God is the God that is about the battered and the broken being redeemed and rescued. And those are the ones who will know far more the glory of God and the gladness God gives than those who trust in their own strength and wisdom to conquer the world, right? That's what we have to remember, that God is the God that floods the dry places. Now, 6 inches of rain was awesome here, but we have trees that went overnight. And the ground drained, and we live in hills, and it made it to rivers and all of that. But there are places where I have lived before, that if 6 inches of rain fell overnight, it would have doubled the annual rainfall. And it would have flooded the place. I mean, it can just take a 1/4 of an inch downburst in one of these desert places to cause a flash flood that would make a mighty torrent come through. And those desert plants, that crocus that's mentioned there, that might have been looking gray and dried and withdrawn, the moment the moisture hits the soil, it shouts with its blossoms. And so what Isaiah is saying for the people of God that walk in this way, that know in these places, whenever any little hint of God's mercy and grace, when any little drop of his work in our life, anything that we can recognize and be aware for, that we're longing for, like these plants in the desert, that whenever that comes our way, we want to give him the glory. And though we might just be some little desert plant with lots of thorns that nobody wants to hug, we can give God more glory than the cedar forests of Lebanon when it's done not by our work but by his. So that says God brings about this flooding in the dry times in our lives. And we need to look for that. We need to be aware of that. I would say here today for families, for parents, for as you're working with your children, for teenagers, for all that, you would actually have kind of like a spiritual rain gauge ready. Right? I mean, because it's been fun today, it rained, and to listen to everybody talk about how much rain they got, right? And to be aware of that. But how good are we at checking the rain gauge for God's work in our lives? From what he's blessing us with, what we've received from what he's done in our lives, his rescue and his redemption. Man, are we checking that? Right? Are we listening to somebody say their story about what God had done, or what challenges they were facing, or what dry moments were there that God overwhelmed with his grace? We need to train ourselves to be aware of those times and be aware of God's flooding in the dry moments. Because the dry moments are there. I mean, the Isaiah the prophet doesn't skip the fact that there are hands that are feeble, knees that give way, and hearts that know fear. That's a condition of our living. But in the midst of it, we can be aware of God's flooding. The other thing is that God's gift of footing in difficult times changes everything. That God's path is there because he walks and he carries us along there. He carries us, as was said, through the valley of the shadow of death. He carries us along through those dark times. He led his people through the wilderness to the promised land. God gives that footing in the difficult times. The last thing you see there is, just teach this truth. Where'd it go? There, still. That God is ready also to give fullness in times that are dangerous, when it is difficult. That we need to be aware we don't live in a time where everybody is all hunky-dory and happy about the redemption of Jesus Christ and the need to admit sin and the need to acknowledge that left to our own human resources, we will choose greed, pleasures of the flesh, temporary gains of power, and we'll trade all of that, all of the glory of God, for stuff that doesn't last. But the word of the prophet here is that those who get it, those who know that Jesus gets us, enter the promised land with singing and everlasting joy. I mean, there's no mute button on the radio for a believer in Jesus Christ when it comes to expressing what he's done for us. I mean, just to stop and think for a bit. And sometimes it gets quiet through the echoes of time. But you want to know something interesting about us as Baptists? We have been people of awakenings and revivals and awareness of God's work among us that has caused people to complain that we were too loud. And the camp meetings that Baptists had in the 1800s, we were ridiculed because we were the worship services were too exuberant and too loud, and people were shouting, and the singing was too loud. Those Baptists need to have a little more reservation in the way that they worship. That was what was going on. In the early 1950s, when some students on a campus in Waco and several other college campuses around the state began to become aware of God's work in their life. There had been kind of a little bit of a darkness, as you can understand it, for those who had come back from the war, and many of these were on the campuses studying under the GI Bill, one of whom was my father, who had just come back from the Korean War. And up at Falls Creek in Oklahoma, there was like a college week that was there that was going on, and guys like Bo Baker and Dick Baker and Bruce McKeever and a guy you know, Milton Cunningham, those guys were all there, and they saw hundreds of college students begin to come to faith in Christ, one of whom was my father. And they go back to the campuses, and they have these kind of unbridled worship experience at what was written, new songs, but we sing them today as old hymns. But they were brand new songs, and people were going like, oh, these young people today, they're too loud. Are you following me here? Man, when joy takes hold, I want to be the person that's worried about risking my hearing than the one that finds a way to hunt for the mute button. Because that's what Isaiah is saying when God shows up. That God gives that when the flooding comes in the dry, the flowers bloom. When there's footing in the difficult times, there's a certainness on the path. And when there's fullness in the dangerous, you can stand up for whatever may come. Because really, as a follower of Christ, what is the absolute worst that could happen to any of us? Right answer, nothing. If God's got a hold of us and promises never to let go, and Jesus says nothing can snatch us out of his hand, right? Remember that. Praise God, sister. There ought to be more of those. But we've learned to turn the volume down. And I'm not here to manufacture a shout of praise or a hallelujah for you today, but remember that even in the difficult moments, look for how it works. John the Baptist, one that was the prophet before Christ, right? The one who preached before him, his cousin was there. Later on in Luke 7, it tells the story of how John, had been arrested, and he's in prison for proclaiming in Christ and for leading people, according to the religionists, away. And so he's there in prison, and he sends in Luke 7, some disciples come and tell him about what's happening with Jesus. And he sends them to him, and he says, ask him, are you the one who is to come? Or should we expect someone else? I mean, this is the baby that in the womb was leaping, going that, and that both Elizabeth and then Mary are celebrating that because John knew that Jesus was the Messiah. John knew that Jesus was the Messiah when he baptized him, and the Spirit of God came down like a dove upon him. The voice from heaven shouted, "This is my Son in whom I'm well pleased." I mean, John had had those experiences, but he's having a dry time. And he says, are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else? And they go and ask Jesus. And Jesus gives back an answer. And if you've looked at the text there in Luke 7, by that time, he has cured many diseases. He has healed lame knees, driven out evil spirits, caused eyes that were blind to see, and ears that were plugged to come unplugged, and tongues that were mute to be able to shout. Jesus had done the things here, the in that day kind of things. And Jesus replies to the messengers, go back and report to John what you've seen and heard. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead raised, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor. Jesus left out one little thing, because in the midst of that passage in Isaiah 62, it says, and the captives will be set free. John never got set free in the earthly sense, but was later executed in prison. But verse 23, Jesus said, blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me. You see, this is hard stuff, but the joy we have helps us endure in the dry times. When we know that whatever we're in is not how it always will be, and how it will be is how it always will be. We live in that day. Allow me to restate the text considering the incarnation. I'm just going to change it just a little bit. Ready? Strengthen the feeble hands now. Steady the knees that give way now. Say to those with fearful hearts, be strong, do not fear. Your God has come. He has come with vengeance and with divine retribution. He has come to save you. Praise be to God for that. You know, I've had the real privilege in life as a pastor, being around people, being around some who really get this. I mean, they've inspired me. They've moved me. None probably as much as a lady named Grace Bowles. Kelly's going to start crying thinking about Grace. When I arrived to pastor my first church, Grace was at the point in life where she couldn't walk anymore. The years of bending them, caring for kids, helping and serving in the church and in the community, her knees were just unable to bear her weight. Her ears, no hearing aid could break through to what they were. In fact, to go visit Grace, it was always like, Grace, it's your pastor. And she said, oh, I'm so glad you came. Her eyes were clouded over. Grace had gotten to the point where her family was taking turns staying with her. One morning, she woke up and she said to one of her daughters that was there, and she said, hey, Sally, I had the most wonderful dream. I was walking down this beautiful street, and there were trees, and in the trees there were these birds singing, and in the flower beds there were these flowers, just they were abundantly blooming that were there. And as I was walking down, I could feel the sun on my face and see how beautiful that it was. Sally said, wow, Mom, that must have been a wonderful dream. Before lunch, Grace had a massive stroke. And that afternoon, went to walk and to sing and to see and to shout. But the joy in her heart that she knew would happen one day, even though she lived in a time she couldn't see, hear, or even walk through it, witnessed that that day was already happening in her heart. How about us? Are we loud enough to leap for joy?